Thanks a lot, Sarah. So my name is Janne Seppänen. I'm the project manager of the NGDP 2021 project, and I work as a senior expert at ThinkGrid. So I will give you a short introduction to the Nordic Grid Development Perspective project. And before going to that, I would like to thank all the attendees. I can see that we have more than 200 people at the moment in the call. So thanks a lot for your interest towards our Nordic collaboration work. So here you can see the background of the Nordic Grid Development Perspective project. The NGDP is requested by the Nordic Council of Ministers, and this report is published every second year. So we are doing this exercise every second year. The previous NGDP 2019 was delivered in 2019, and it described the status of ongoing and planned investments of Nordic significance and investigated the need of and benefits of increased transmission capacities between the Nordic countries over 5 different corridors of interest. So where the previous NGDP was more a traditional grid development plan, this time we decided to have a little bit different approach. So this time our aim for the NGDP 2021 is to present a common Nordic view on selected key topics rather than presenting a traditional technical grid development plan in purely traditional sense. So that's why we are naming this NGDP 21 as a Nordic grid development perspective. So I think everybody here knows that the energy system is changing now faster than ever. And a lot has already changed since the previous NGDP 2019. So on the left-hand side, you can see the development of Nordic electricity consumption. At the moment, our electricity consumption is approximately 400 terawatt-hours per year. In the previous NGDP 2019, we were expecting the consumption to increase from 400 to about 430 terawatt-hours by 2030, and approximately 480 terawatt-hours by 2040. But now, in our newest scenario, we are expecting the consumption to increase up to 530 terawatt-hours by 2030, and to 655 terawatt-hours by 2040. So quite easy rule of thumb is to remember that our scenario assumes the Nordic electricity consumption to increase by 1/3 by 2030 and 2/3 by 2040. On the other hand, also the production capacity is changing faster than ever. So in the year 2020, our wind power production capacity was approximately 20 gigawatts, a little bit higher than 20 gigawatts in the Nordics. And our previous NGDP 2019 assumed that to grow approximately to 30 gigawatts by 2030 and up to 50 gigawatts by 2040. But now, in our newest scenario, we are expecting the wind capacity to increase to 60 gigawatts by 2030 and almost to 90 gigawatts by 2040. So in generally speaking, the Nordic renewable energy sources capacity in total increases from the current 85 gigawatts to about 145 gigawatts by 2030 and more than doubles to 189 gigawatts by 2040. Next slide, please. So here you can see the scope of our project. Our project was based on creating a common Nordic scenario, which we call Climate Neutral Nordics. And this scenario is based on ENTSO-E's TYNDP 2020 scenario distributed energy and the latest national scenarios from all the TSOs. Our scenario was also presented in an earlier stakeholder webinar and publicly consulted. So thank you everybody who gave your feedback and your input to our scenario work. Based on the scenario, we did several different studies. And one of them was this identification of system needs, where we analyzed the power system needs in the Nordic system at a higher level in our created scenario, meaning that we analyzed where we should invest in grid capacities at a high level in the future. We also investigated different focus areas in our work. So we investigated north-south transfer, resource adequacy, and offshore wind. And today we will hear a presentation about the scenario, about the identification of system needs, and also these different focus areas. In addition, we also updated the status of the Nordic corridors from the NGDP 2019 and give you an update on the national planned and ongoing grid projects of Nordic interest. The timeline of the project is as follows. We started the project already more than a year ago, so in the fall 2020. In the beginning of this year, we finished our scenario work and also consulted the scenario with the stakeholders and organized a stakeholder webinar. In the summer, in Q2, we completed our IOS analysis, so the identification of system needs, and also our focus area work. Now we are in Q4 this year, and we have published the report, so I recommend everybody to have a look at it. It's in all the TSO web pages. And now we are organizing this final stakeholder webinar of our project. Next slide, please. Our organization can be seen on this slide. So as Daniel mentioned, we were steered by the NPG, the Nordic Planning Group, and we also had a project management team consisting of line managers from all the TSOs. Then I had a pleasure of working with approximately 20 different experts from all the TSOs. And we, like I mentioned before, stakeholder input and transparency and organizing a consultation for the webinar for the scenario was also very important for our work. Next slide. So I would like to conclude my presentation by giving the main messages of our NGDP report. The first main message is that climate neutral society needs more electricity, and we need to make significant investments to the grid and cross-border connections in the future. So I think that the flows in the future system are increasing, and also in some cases existing flow patterns might change significantly, meaning that the flow might actually go to the opposite direction that we are used to. The second main message is that Nordics is an excellent place for future investments. So we have a strong grid, we have a lot of clean electricity available, and then also I believe that we have cheap electricity in the long run, especially compared with some other areas. The third message is that future system is more volatile. We need flexibility, and flexibility will also be more profitable in the future. So I think this volatility applies in all the different aspects of the power system, flows, prices, adequacy questions, and so on. So flexibility is really essential for the operation of the future system, both in the consumption and in the generation side. And we believe that there are some profitable ways to operate these flexibility resources in the future. We also believe that the future system is becoming more and more complex, and it has new characteristics. We need new solutions and collaboration throughout the whole energy system to solve these new challenges. So not only collaboration between the TSOs, but also with the stakeholders to operate the future system in an optimal way. I believe that we have very good potential to be the winners of this green energy transition here in the Nordic countries if we just work together and operate the system in an optimal way. The last point is that regional plans will be updated and developed. So we will continue publishing this Nordic grid development perspective every second year. NGDP publishes the NGDP, the 10-year network development plan, and also all TSOs are publishing their national plans and scenarios continuously. I would like to end my presentation by stating that we are not just talking, we are also doing a lot. So during the next 10 years, we, the Nordic TSOs, are building over 10,000 kilometers of lines, over 100 new substations, and we are making total investments worth about 25 billion euros. So we believe that this investment will enable new investments multiple times this much to the clean, climate neutral Nordic society. So now I will hand over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Janne, for drawing up the bigger picture on the analysis and the main messages. And now it's time to turn over to the next topic, climate neutral Nordic scenario. And then we will listen to Mathias Mølbæk Christensen, who is a system analyst at Energinet in Denmark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. Yeah, so my name is Mathias Mølbæk, as Sarah just said. I was the convener for the scenario building group that was part of making this scenario to be used in the NGDP 21. And during the next 20-odd minutes, I will give an introduction to the scenario in a bit more detail than what Jan and Daniel just went through, to help create a little better context for you to see the identification of system needs studies and also the focus area studies. This slide is very text heavy, so you don't have to read it. The material will be available afterwards. You can read it there if you wish. But the main point, and Daniel and Janne already touched upon this, is that the Nordic TSO's overall goal is that fulfilling the goal of decarbonization. And we do this by a high degree of direct and indirect electrification, so by a large increase in the consumption. That increase in consumption needs to be covered, and we do that mainly through wind power, but solar is also a big part here. And then to help balance the system, we rely on the hydro reservoirs in the Nordic region, as well as demand side response, and also the flexibility from power to X. And you can access the link below there, and I think it should be also in the chat for direct access from the previous webinar we held dedicated to the scenario. Yeah, this table shows a bit more in detail how we see the development in each type of technology. So it shows a difference or the development from today's system towards 2040. 1+ symbolizes a small increase, while 3+ is a large increase. Equal sign is status quo, and a minus is a negative or a phase out of a technology. Just so everyone is on the same page about how to interpret this figure. So as I just mentioned, there's a heavy reliance on the onshore and offshore wind, which you can see on the top part of this table. It's primarily Finland and Sweden depend on the onshore development, where Denmark and Norway utilize the offshore more. All the countries see a development in PVs during the period, but to a lesser extent compared to the wind. When we look at the thermal, so in this here, that's the nuclear power and also the other thermal power. Nuclear power isn't, in this scenario towards 2040, there isn't happening that much. The primary change is a decommission of fossil fuels in the other thermal power category. And as Daniel and Janne touched upon, the electricity consumption is increasing a lot in this scenario. Both the classical categories, but also, for example, Power-to-X, which is a main driver in the scenario. And then to help balance the system, as I just mentioned before, we have the demand-side response to kind of help with balancing low hours with low contribution from wind and solar, and help shift some of that to some of the more expensive hours. Then we look at the electricity balance, where the overall trend is that the Nordic region is going towards more exports, so a higher power margin, and we'll touch upon this in greater detail in a minute. Each section has sort of their own slides in a minute here. But if we start here at where we started, so we chose to build our Nordic scenario on top of distributed energy from the TYNDP 2020. We did that because we want to reflect the European system as well, and we want the European system to be in a similar storyline, so in a green, ambitious manner, alongside the ambitious Nordic system that we see. And distributed energy fits that storyline pretty well. It contains a large increase in consumption. It has high degree of self-sufficiency through Power-to-X, and thereby also a very large amount of renewables. So in the main lines, it fits the climate neutral Nordic scenario storyline very well. Yeah. So we also took from this scenario, we took the fuel prices. So that's the nuclear, the coal and the gas, heavy oil and CO2 price. We took that from distributed energy to not start from scratch. But there were some fuels that we didn't feel was reflected in those through the TYNDP, so we made our own assumptions. That's for peat, low sulfur fuel oil, and also for hydrogen, where we made our own assumptions. The main takeaway from the development in the fuel prices here is that coal and oil prices increase, and so does the CO2. Almost doubling between 2030 and 2040. And then we have the hydrogen price that decreases because of the efficiencies of the electrolyzers are expected to increase, so technology improvements in that sector. Yeah. Getting back to the Nordic scenario, and getting back to the consumption more specifically here, we can see this large increase in the consumption from approximately 400 terawatt hours to more than 650 in 2040. And the main driver of this increase is the bright green in the middle of the graph there. That's the Power-to-X, which accounts for almost 110 terawatt hours in 2040. So that's a large increase from the approximately 0 megawatts or terawatt hours in today's system. But there are also other drivers beyond the Power-to-X, even though that's the main one. We also have the electrification of industry. We have the indirect and direct electrification of transport. Those account for 50 terawatt hours each, almost. So those are also quite significant. Then we have some minor increases in, for example, data centers and also heat pumps. But the main ones are Power-to-X, industry, and electric vehicles. And the Power-to-X is asset accounts for such a large share here, and it was also kind of a focus in the scenario building process. So let's take a closer look at the Power-to-X development in the Nordics here. So it's really expected to gain traction in this scenario, which we can also see from the graph, where it increases quite significantly, especially in 2040. the hydrogen has some benefits that we very much like in such a scenario, because it can provide flexibility in multiple ways. Firstly, it can help supply carbon-based synthetic fuels, for example, for air transport. It can also help with flexibility in periods with high prices, so to stop producing when the price is too high, and also to use the hydrogen as fuel for peaker units. It also creates some value as a low price flexibility, because it can focus on utilizing cheap electricity from renewable energy sources. So that way also increasing the value of the power created by these sources. It was a focus, especially because we had to do some improvement to the methodology provided by NGDP. In NGDP, Power-to-X is disconnected from the electricity market and is only taking electricity from its dedicated renewable units, so it doesn't interact with the electricity market. And we felt that it should be in the electricity market to show the dynamics of this integrated system. So in this project, we also improved this methodology, and we coupled the Power-to-X, the dedicated renewables for the Power-to-X, to the electricity market, to the classical way of modeling it, to better reflect these potential dynamics in the sectors. And to do this, we also had to make some assumptions at the hydrogen price. If we look at the generation development, we can take the top graph first, the top figure first. That's the renewable sector. We can see, if you start from the bottom, we have the hydro capacity. It's fairly stable throughout the period. There's a slight increase in the capacity in Norway, but it's fairly stable. And we can also see that it's still, and we still expect it to be, a quite significant part of the Nordic system. Also, as I mentioned before, wind increases a lot. That's both onshore, primarily in Finland and Sweden, and then the offshore, primarily in Denmark and Norway, but especially through the energy islands in Denmark. And then we also have a good increase from photovoltaics, and that's spread out across all the countries. If we then go down to the bottom figure, we can see the thermal development, where we see nuclear and waste. That's fairly stable. That doesn't change much throughout the period. There's a slight decrease in the nuclear. The main point here is that the fossil fuels is getting reduced from 6 gigawatts to 2. And that, well, 2 gigawatts of thermal or this reduction in thermal creates some issues at some point, because it's the controllable capacity that we're phasing out and replacing with more fluctuating energy sources as wind and solar. If we just compare the two graphs and the scales of them, we can also see that the renewable capacity ends up at about 150, 190 gigawatts, whereas the thermal ends up at 13 gigawatts. So that's a significant difference between the two, and also shows that the scenario in 2040 is very, very green, very based on renewables. If you go to the next slide. As I just touched upon, a Nordic system without fossil fuels, at least some of them phased out, creates some issues here. We need something to sort of fill the gap in hours with high demand and low production from solar and wind. And this could call for new technologies to emerge in the market. It could be, for example, that flexible demand and Power-to-X could help in these periods where it could cut off and not produce or consume. And furthermore, as I said before, Power-to-X can also serve to increase the value of electricity in the bottom part of the price curve. The stored hydrogen that is produced from the power from electrolyzers can also be used as a fuel for peaker units in very scarce hours to serve as additional capacity for when needed. And then, of course, we have the hydro reservoirs and batteries that can serve as a method to shift wind and solar production from periods with low demand to periods with high demand. The electricity balance is, as we can see in this figure, is positive in all years. I should maybe say that electricity balance is the difference between the consumption and production. So we have more production than we have consumption. And that is true throughout the entire period that we looked at. So from today's system, where we have about 13 terawatt hours, to the system in 2040, where we have above 50 terawatt hours. So that's a large increase in the electricity balance. The large surplus in 2040 could serve to attract more consumption. It should serve to do that, because the system will reach an equilibrium or a balance where a high surplus will attract more consumption, as a high deficit will attract more production units. So it should balance it out at some point when it finds an equilibrium. However, we also see that even this is a very averaged over a year figure, but the generation becomes a lot more variable, a lot more weather dependent, which makes these challenges of maintaining the instantaneous power margin larger. And I think we will also touch upon that in the adequacy section later on. If we then look at the prices, which are very correlated to the electricity margin, we can see that on the graph, the prices are dropping. We used Sweden 3, SE3 here as the Nordic proxy for the prices to make a more simple figure. And then we use Germany as a proxy for the continental system. So we see that not only is the price dropping in the Nordics, but it's also a lot lower than what it is in the continental system, which further backs up my previous point that it is likely that there's additional consumption or industrial process could benefit from these low prices in the Nordic area. It should also be said that this is just from Sweden 3, and this is not true for every hour, because there's a lot of different dynamics going in the Nordic system. So in some hours you will have very low prices in some part of the Nordics, while other hours will produce high prices. Just one slide back. Just to build the bridge to the next slide here, the price projections like this are very dependent on a lot of different assumptions that we made. These assumptions usually carry some degree of uncertainty, whether that being a small or high degree of uncertainty. It bears some degree of uncertainty, which makes price projections a very tough thing to do. And now we can go to the next slide with a list of these uncertainties that could change the results and change the dynamics, change the system. That could, for example, be the fuel and CO2 prices that I presented earlier. The level of those could change the energy mix completely. And it could also hinder or increase the development of Power-to-X And then there's how Power-to-X is even operated. That's a totally different question. That's also very uncertain. We have the development of electricity consumption. So where will it be? How large will the increase be? And will it be flexible? And will it be able to see the price, and therefore we can utilize the demand side response? We have the entire batteries or different type of storage, for example, electric vehicles or different types of large-scale storage. How will they impact the system, and how large of a role will they have? The development of wind power capacity is very uncertain as well. So especially for offshore wind, and the entire thought of offshore grids and new connection types such as energy islands which from a few years ago was very novel. Now it's gaining traction, and now it's more of a question of how and how this configuration is going to look at some point in time. Then there's also the whole deal about the phase out of nuclear production. So the rate of that, and also the entire uncertainty of the whole infrastructure. That's both from the electricity side, which is overhead lines and the HVDC connections, but also for the hydrogen or the Power-to-X products. What kind of infrastructure will there be there to increase the flexibility and to integrate the systems even more in the future? That's also a very parameter that could change a lot in these scenarios. I think that was about what I wanted to say. That should cover most of the scenario, and as I said previously, there's more detailed material in the report, and also in the link in the chat where we had the previous webinar. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Matthias. And we are a bit ahead of schedule, actually. We're now having a 10 minutes break, which makes it we reunite again in the webinar at 5 to 2. So 13:55, we reunite again in the webinar. See you a bit later. Welcome back from the break. Now it's time to listen to the perspective future system needs. We will listen to Lasse Christiansen, who is a senior analyst at the Statnett in Norway. The stage is yours, Lasse.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I'm working in the market department, the market analysis department in Statnett, and I was also convener for the investigation of system needs that we're going to talk about now. Next slide. This chapter presents an analysis which seeks to identify the need for increased capacity between existing bidding zones in the Nordic region. And this is based on the scenario climate neutral Nordics. We have used absolute price differences between existing bidding zones as a metric, and we have also focused on the power flows in this study. As this report is a perspective rather than an investment plan, the results should be considered as a starting point for further analysis. This means that more detailed studies and analysis is required before an actual investment decision can be made. The grid modeling is based on the current grid capacities and each TSO's national 10-year grid development plan. The simulations have been done based on this reference grid. The price difference between two price zones says something about the size of the cost of the bottleneck and the potential benefit of increasing the grid capacity. The size of the price differences is again a result of the difference in the marginal cost of the power plants, which setting the price on each side of this bottleneck. And high price difference indicates that the benefit of more grid capacity is high. We can say that the price differences say something about the potential for real economic growth of increased capacity and utilize the production capacity in a more efficient way. The analysis has used absolute hour-by-hour price differences as a metric for the economic benefit of the grid capacity between the bidding zones in the Nordic region. And this method also reflects the marginal benefit of increasing the grid capacity by 1 megawatt. The calculation is only based on the reference grid without any increasing in the capacities in the corridors. The study does not consider what an optimal capacity between the areas would be, but rather there is a marginal benefit for increasing the capacity on each bidding zones independently. Further on, the analysis does not consider costs of grid capacity, and no cost-benefit analysis has been done. Other benefits related to integration of renewable security of supply is not included as well. The northern parts of the Nordic are today a large surplus area. Also the west and southern part of Norway in a normal weather year is also a surplus area. Most of the consumption is placed in the southern parts of the Nordic countries. And because of that, the main flow in the Nordic power system is today from the surplus areas in the north to the deficit areas in the south and further on towards the continent. The figure to the left here represents the historical year 2020, which also was a quite wet year with high inflow in most of the Nordic countries. Towards 2040, the electricity balance is increasing at the Nordic level, but there are some local differences. High consumption growth in the northern part reduced the surplus, and this is especially in Sweden in price area SE1, where the electricity balance reduces from plus 13 terawatt hours to minus 15 terawatt hours in 2040. However, the electricity balance in the southern part is strengthened due to offshore wind and energy islands. In total, the energy balance from 2030 to 2040 are increasing, but the energy mix also has a higher share of intermittent production. And together with the consumption growth, this increase also the volatility in the Nordic power balance as well. Then you can go to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. Towards 2040, a high consumption growth as well as a high share of intermittent production will affect the flow pattern and the price differences between the bidding zones. There are some important drivers who affect the power flows to a large degree. Higher share of intermittent production results in a more volatile power flows, depending also on the wind production. Also, consumption growth and the location of the consumption is an important factor here. Increasing interconnector capacity towards the continent will also increase the power flows in the Nordic power system. And in general, all these factors and the general market development will affect the bottlenecks in the power system. The figure here shows the power flows in the Nordic for the historical year 2020 and the simulated year 2040 for this scenario. The size of the arrows reflects the yearly energy flows in the system. Towards 2040, the power flows are more often going in both directions compared to today, where we have a typical north-south power flows, and we have a shift also in the power flows between some areas, especially in the northern part and in the south, where the power flows increasing due to our assumption for offshore wind and energy islands. The power flows are dependent of the general market development, so less consumption growth or higher share of renewables production that we have assumed in this scenario or other assumptions can result in other power flows or flows pattern in the Nordic power system. Next slide, please. The price differences increasing from today towards 2040 in this scenario. The price differences are increasing both due to increased consumption, higher share of intermittent production, and less thermal production. In addition, high price volatility on the continent due to increasing consumption and more renewables also affect the Nordic power prices and the price differences that we see here. The figure to the left here shows an estimate of the price differences today based on average prices from 2016 to 2020. Towards 2040, we see that the price differences increases in mostly all corridors, especially in the northern and the southern parts of the Nordic power system. And this is mainly due to the high consumption growth in the northern part and more renewable and more surplus in the southern areas. Next slide, please. So, in the summary, increasing price differences is an indicator for the need for the increased grid capacity. But it doesn't show the whole picture. And it doesn't mean the same as the investments are socio-economic profitable. New grid investments must also consider the cost, the total investments and maintenance costs. Other factors like market dynamics and the general market development may go in a direction, maybe where the price differences can be decreased. And also then the profitability of new grid capacities can be decreased. Investments in peak capacity and demand flexibility will also affect the power prices and the price differences. In addition, we have also to consider other measures like dynamic line rating, compensator, and measures like that also has to be considered. So the Nordic TSOs, we are investing in the most cost-efficient options for the total Nordic power system. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lasse. And now we have come to the part in the agenda where we will look more into detail in 3 different focus areas. Each of them will have a short presentation. And the first person on stage is Jan Lavenius, Power System Analyst at Svenska Kraftnät. The floor is yours, Jan.
Thank you. So next slide, please. As Lasse mentioned, we have a general north to south flow today, as we can see in the top figure here for year 2020. Here we show a region consisting of the northern parts of Sweden, Finland, and Norway, where we had a surplus of 22 terawatt-hours in 2020. But in the future, this surplus will decrease to only 7 terawatt-hours. And this is due to increasing wind production and power takes in this area. So you see that both of these staples to the right have increased considerably since 2020. And due to this shift in balance, we will also see new flow patterns that we haven't seen yet in the Nordic system. For example, if you look at the lower picture here, you see that this deficit in SC1, as Lasse mentioned, will be 15 terawatt-hours in 2040, while the surpluses will increase in SC2 and Finland, the northern part of Finland, which we call Finland North here. So we have changing flow patterns that we haven't seen yet. Where it used to go from north to south, we can see that it has reversed. We go from SC2, which is south of SC1, and go up to SC1. And also these flows are mostly increasing. And we yet still see these more variable flows, both in energy and in power, that can vary very much, both in direction and size. But our grid in the Nordic countries are usually built for this north-south energy exchange. So we will still see a major exchange along this north to south axis, but the direction is not so clear anymore. So next slide, please. So here I will talk a little bit about how grid capacity and power to X in each country interact with these changed north to south flows. And if we start with Denmark, we see that there is not too much change inside of Denmark. The huge change is how much wind power is exchanged along these HVDC connectors to continental Europe and to offshore wind farms. And of course, you need lines then to connect this to the demand centers, which is often near cities. And here we see that the power to X projects in South Denmark are usually placed near where they have demand today, near cities. And depending on this flexibility, how flexible this power to X can be, it can either mitigate or aggravate future capacity problems. If we look then to Norway, we see that the north-south flows are increasing, and we also have more variability in which direction it has. And Norway's TSO is voltage upgrading its transmission net until 2040, and this will give more north to south capacity. This in turn will reduce price differences in Norway and enable more industry, electrified industry and offshore wind to be developed all over Norway. And here for power to X, there are several concrete plans for rollout. and they are distributed over the whole country, which is a good thing when it comes to the need for grid capacity. Next slide, please. If we go down to Sweden, we see that in the middle of Sweden, there will still be a large exchange north to south of energy. In the south, we will have more variable flows, slightly decreased, and in the north, we will have this increased flow, which has also changed direction. And we have substantial grid investments planned already for this continued heavy north to south flows in the middle of Sweden. But due to this power to X development in the north, more grid investments might be needed in the north in SE1. And as I said, power to X at the moment is mainly concentrated in northern part in SE1, which helps reduce problems with the large north to south flow in the middle, but can give some new bottlenecks in the northern parts of Sweden. And finally, if we look at Finland, we see that the north to south flow is heavily increasing. And fortunately, the Finnish TSO have already made large investments in the north-south transmission lines, and more are planned. And this will help solve three things. We see that the most wind power is expected to come in the north, which has to be transferred to the demand centers in the south. We will see that there will be more HVDC interconnections, which require this quite strong grid inside of Finland. And we will need this strong connection north to south to keep Finland as one bidding zone. And when it comes to power to X, there are huge potential in Finland for power to X, but at the moment we have a hard time to see exactly when or where this power to X will be built inside Finland. So if I conclude, we see that these north-south flows are changing, but we have large investments planned to handle this. And power to X can either mitigate or aggravate these capacity problems that might occur in the future, depending on how flexible it will be. So that is my final slide. I would like to hand over to Dalibor from Statnett. Next slide, please. Dalibor Wagner is an analyst at Statnett who will talk about resource adequacy. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, I work in market analysis department in Statnett, and I'm here to present the topic resource adequacy. Next slide, please. So, as we have already been talking about, increased demand and more intermittent sources in the power system lead to adequacy concerns. And that's why we did this analysis where we looked at the metrics called power margin, which help us to measure resource adequacy. It consists of available production capacity in every hour of a year. That means hydropower capacity and thermal and nuclear available capacity, plus the expected wind and solar and run-of-river production for that particular hour. And from this, we subtract the current consumption before the demand-side response flexibility is applied. We do this for every hour, and we get either positive number or negative number. For those hours with positive power margin, that means that in those hours, the area has excess available capacity. And that also means that this area can export electricity. While in those hours with negative power margin, it shows that the area has not enough resources to cover the consumption. And the value of this negative number represents the total need for either import or demand flexibility or extra peak capacity in terms of, for example, batteries or hydrogen peakers, biogas peakers, etc. And it's important to note that that's why we used the current consumption before the demand side response flexibility was applied. And also we did not add any extra peakers in the data set, so that this negative power margin is showing the total need for all those three things. Next slide, please. So here are results. The results vary a lot in the Nordic countries, but we see that in all the Nordic countries, the resource adequacy situation is getting worse over time. In this table down, we see that from 2030 to 2040, the number of hours, the percentage of the numbers of hours with negative power margin is decreasing in every country. And also the value of this maximum negative power margin is also decreasing. Some of those problems can be resolved on the Nordic level because the countries can share the resources via transmission. But even for the whole Nordics region, we see that the number of hours with negative power margin is increasing from 3% in 2030 to 28% in 2040. And also the value of power margin is decreasing. And that's also what we see on this graph as a duration curve. That only shows that in order to cover the consumption in the periods with low renewable production, we would need to invest in import capacity from the continent and the UK, and flexible consumption solutions like smart control devices or hydrogen production, which we talked about, or smart electric cars with smart charging, etc. And peak generation capacity, which could be hydrogen peakers or biofuels peakers, pump hydro, etc. So that is all from me. And I would give my word to Christian, who will present the focus area of offshore wind.
Thank you very much, Dalibor. Offshore energy resources is an important part in Europe's goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050. The EU Commission aims to have approximately 60 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity in 2030 and 300 gigawatts in 2050. Significant amounts of these wind farms will be connected to the Nordics, both in the Baltic Sea and in the North Sea. Next slide, please. The Nordic TSOs expect a significant increase in connected offshore wind over the next 20 years. Today, the total capacity of connected offshore wind is approximately 2.5 gigawatts, which you can see to the left in this chart. The climate neutral Nordic scenario assumes the capacity to increase to 17 gigawatts in 2030 and 35 gigawatts in 2040, as can be seen in the next two columns. In the right two columns, the national TSO scenarios are presented. In Sweden and Finland, there are 4 national TSO scenarios, and the black dots show the minimum and maximum in these scenarios. And as you can see, there is a wide range between the lowest and the highest. There are different approaches in the Nordic countries today regarding how to connect offshore wind. In Denmark and Norway, there is a centralized system where areas for potential new offshore wind farms are identified by the respective governments and made available for tender in an auction system. In Sweden and Finland, there is a decentralized system where the developers decide where to develop the offshore wind farms, and the developers submit applications for the potential wind farms to the authorities. The decentralized systems leads to a large amount of connection inquiries. For example, Fingrid has received approximately 20 gigawatts of offshore wind power connection inquiries at the time of writing this report, and Svenska Kraftnät has received approximately 120 gigawatts of offshore wind connection inquiries. So the interest from the industry is enormous. In Denmark and Finland, the developer pays for the connection plus standard grid connection fees, but it is Energinet's and Fingrid's responsibility to develop and fund needed grid reinforcements onshore. In Sweden, the system today, the developer pay for the grid connection and the reinforcements onshore. That only benefits the developer. Reinforcements onshore that benefits others as well are paid by Svenska kraftnät. Next slide, please. Offshore wind requires new methods in the future. The 4 TSOs in our Nordic countries have different responsibilities. In Norway, the government has published a parliamentary white paper that indicates that the developers should take the cost for connection to shore and necessary grid reinforcements onshore. But the details are subject for both political discussions and further investigation. Ownership on future hybrid connections is not decided, but is one of the issues that will be further investigated. And it is proposed by the former government that Statnett will be appointed as system operator offshore, which would be equivalent to their role onshore. In Sweden, the TSO, Svenska kraftnät, has recently received a new instruction by the government, an instruction that will be taken into force 1st of January next year. And this is the reason for the huge amount of connection inquiries offshore in Sweden at the moment. According to the new instruction, Svenska kraftnät should build transmission grid within the territorial waters in order to promote the fulfillment of the Swedish target of 100% renewable electricity production by 2040. So this doesn't mean that Svenska kraftnät should build connections to all projects that has made connection inquiries. Svenska kraftnät will be able to choose where to build the transmission grid at sea, where to build platforms with offshore substations, and where to connect the onshore transmission grid. For connections that will not be built by Svenska kraftnät, the project developer is still required to build and pay for the connection to the grid, the same way as it is today. Looking at Denmark, in addition to radial connections, which they have built quite a lot of and continues to do, the Danish legislature has decided to construct 2 energy islands, one in the North Sea with a starting capacity of 3 gigawatts, with a potential for expansion up to 10 gigawatts. And in the Baltic Sea, on Bornholm, an energy island with a capacity of 2 gigawatts. In Denmark, it has been determined that the wind developers will fund the radial connection between the wind farm and the energy islands, and Energinet will own and operate the critical infrastructure on the energy islands and onshore. Energinet and the other TSOs involved will own the interconnectors between the energy islands and the mainland in the respective countries. And the actual island will be owned by a private and public ownership arrangement. A hybrid offshore grid is, in this context, an interconnector between 2 countries with an offshore hub on the interconnector where an offshore wind farm is connected. So a hybrid offshore grid both transports produced wind power and enable trade between 2 or more markets. As such, they also come with the new challenges to overcome, like the issue of ownership and operations, costs and benefit allocations, complexity of contractual arrangement, and possibility of future expandability. From a grid planning perspective, the planning of grid connections for radially connected offshore wind farms is relatively straightforward and national in its nature. However, hybrid offshore solutions with connections to several countries might require development of completely new or updated grid planning principles, such as dimensioning of the offshore grid, fault withstand, interoperability, system operation principles, etc. So wrapping up this offshore section, I would like to say that the Nordic TSOs, together with the TSOs along the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, continue to work closely on tools needed to integrate the expected capacity of offshore wind in the future, such as grid planning practices, standardization, data sharing, improved grid operation, effective use of reserves and harmonization of balanced services. And with this, I would like to thank you for listening and hand over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you all the panelists for giving us excellent insights from this Nordic analysis. And it might be added that you are also the co-authors of this Nordic report. There are other co-authors as well, apart from these panelists, but thank you so much, all of you. And now I know that we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So let's move over to the Q&A session right away. Together with me here in the studio, I have John Lavenius and Anders Nilsbeth, and we have the other team participants, and also Daniel Gustafsson with us. So just give me a few seconds to bring up the questions received, and we will distribute them to our experts, the conference. I've seen the questions coming in on the screen. It's just a technical issue to bring them up here now. Oh yes, here they are. Let's start with a question for Lasse. Why year 2020 is chosen despite it's influenced by COVID-19? Will that make any difference in calculations and predictions? So the question to you, Lasse, is you've chosen the year 2020 irrespective of the pandemic situation, and what kind of difference does that make?
Yes, thank you for the question. We have focused on the long term here, the 2030 and the 2040, and the changes in the system from today. So I don't think it will affect the results so much that we are looking at in this types of analysis.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Lasse. Another question. Does the power surplus in SE2 in 2040 trigger higher consumption? And there is a sub-question to that. Will the increase in flow from SE2 to SE1 trigger more flow to NO4 and Finland? I guess that's a question for my colleague in the studio, Jan, here.
Yes, I think Lasse can also fill in on this one regarding to how the price difference will trigger more consumption in SE2. But for Norway 4, I don't think we saw that there will be an export from SE1 to NO4. And when it comes to Finland from SE1, we saw that it was an interchange, but this goes in both directions. But of course, these flows that goes in both directions, they can trigger new bottlenecks inside SE1 and therefore need more grid investments in SE1. Lasse, would you like to fill on SE2, please?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that's also depends on where the location of the consumption here and the production and how it will affect the power flows in the system. But yeah, so I don't have any more things here to fill in. I think it was okay answer by now.
Okay, Lasse, thanks for that. Let's move on in the question list here, because the questions are scrolling in at high speed. We have a question going like this. Have you identified a need for new interconnections between the Nordic countries? And if yes, where are they needed? I don't know, is that a question for Daniel or Janne, or is it, who would like to take that one?
Well, I can take a first short answer, and that is that in this project we have identified the marginal need for interconnections. I mean, looking at the value of the first megawatt. But as said during the presentation, we haven't done any cost analysis, so we can't say if at the end if the CBA will show it to be profitable, and we haven't analyzed in that case what number of what size of interconnector that might be needed. So that is work still ongoing.
That might appear in the next report in 2 years, maybe.
Perhaps, but we also have which hasn't been presented during the webinar today. We have these corridors that have been studied. So there is an ongoing monitoring and making studies on the bilateral connections. There are some interconnectors that are getting old, need to be replaced, and also we have this Aurora line up in north between Sweden and Finland. There are projects and there are ideas, but all haven't been studied in full detail.
Thanks for that, Anders. We move on in the list here. There's a question. Let's see. How is availability of grid capacity handled in this analysis? Take SC3 challenges as an example. Observed price differences in 2021 is almost 10 times your simulated values, in part due to very low availability. So can you comment on that? Let's see who could take that. Is that a question for is it Matthias, maybe? Do you feel like
yeah, I can give some general pointers to how we model the interconnectors, not only the internal one in Sweden, at least from my side in our model. We don't really take any stochastic or longer period revisions into account when doing these sorts of long-term market analysis. So these shorter term availability constraints on the interconnectors are not taken into account. So that's why we don't see this those values that you see in today's system.
Thank you for that, Matthias. And here is another question on renewables. How is investments in new renewable generation decided in the different price areas? Based on acceptance or political decisions? Or is it rather profitability for investors? Is that also a question for you, Matthias? Might be.
Yeah, so the scenario is built on, I think, Daniel also mentioned in the start, it's built on every TSO's best estimate for the future with regards to also the political climate. So, for example, that onshore wind isn't that popular in Denmark, for example, so that makes us go offshore instead. That could be an example for that. We know that onshore is cheaper, but it's not that popular.
Yeah. So it's both policy decisions and the market's response.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Here is another one on flows. Bottlenecks. There's been a constant bottleneck between SC2 and SC3 this year. When will that bottleneck ease up? Is that you, Jan, maybe?
I can try to answer it. So Svenska kraftnät is having a very large program to get to terms with these bottlenecks between SC2 and SC3 called Nordic. And the first investments are starting in the next few years, actually, and will be ongoing up until approximately 2040. And exactly when all bottlenecks will be resolved is a little bit hard to say, but the first programs are starting up now, and we should see results in a few years for like the most acute, most pressing bottlenecks. But all these investments that we do in Nordic between SC2 and SC3 is necessary. So some bottlenecks will probably remain until we have done the whole list of investments that we want to do, because it's a very old grid, which might say something about this reduced availability question that we talked about earlier. So we're seeing that it's getting better, but there's a lot of investments that need to be made in this grid to make it fit for the future.
Thank you, Jan. I scroll further down in the list. We have somebody here writing, thank you for an interesting and informative webinar. Does the TSOs have the necessary regulatory tools and policies in place today for the climate neutral Nordic scenario to be fulfilled? Or if not, what is missing? This is on a high level this question about do we have the right regulatory tools? I don't know if it's a question for you, Daniel, maybe, or Janne, or any other volunteer. It's a very interesting question indeed. And it might differ between the Nordic countries.
You want to comment on that, Janne? And maybe I can fill in.
Yeah, maybe I can just comment that I would say that we don't want to be the bottleneck that stops this climate neutral future. So we are building the grid and developing the grid in such a way that we are able to connect, for example, wind power and all the new resources that will be part of the climate neutral society of the future. So that's at least our goal. We are aiming to do that. Maybe Daniel, do you want to add something else?
No, what I can comment is basically that it was mentioned before that of course in these scenarios we try to take into consideration all the regulatory or the policies that we have, and also in some sense what we believe is going to happen. But of course, in related, for example, to the speed of how we are doing this, that is very depending on what possibilities we have in each country. And there are bottlenecks, or there are items that is limiting the speed, for example, like permit processes and so on. But it's not only up to the TSO. So with this, we want to show basically what we think will happen and what has to happen, and then it will also be an input to the decision makers on a political level to try to enable it from their perspective. So it's a big question. Everything is not in place, but it's an ongoing work all the time to really, yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, who wanted to fill in there? I heard a voice from one of the panelists. I heard somebody wanting to fill in to what Daniel and Janet just said.
I think it might have been me that accidentally pressed a button.
Okay. Well, just adding to that, at least in Sweden, cutting times for permissions and making sure that legislation is more able to deliver time to market is on the agenda, has been on the agenda for the government and will be on the agenda in Parliament soon anyway. So there are legislative processes trying to make sure that the regulation keeps pace with the market needs for prompt regulatory delivery. So it's an ongoing discussion on a governmental level, at least in Sweden. But as you might know, in Sweden we have very long time schedules and lots of possibilities to make appeals to higher courts. So at least in Sweden, this is an ongoing process now. Another question, will the Danish energy islands be connected to other Nordic countries as well? I guess that's a question to maybe to, is it Christian who
I can start with that,
yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, I see that it is a possible possibility in the future that other Nordic.
You're muted, Christian. Could you please unmute?
Did you hear me?
Now we hear you again.
Oh,
Please,
it didn't work?
Please repeat your answer because
Oh,
you were muted.
Yeah, all right. Well, as far as I see it, it is possible in the future, yes, that other Nordic countries will be connected to the energy islands. But as far as I know, there are no agreements today with other Nordic countries. But for example, there are very early discussions between Energinet and Svenska Kraftnät in this regarding this possibility.
Thank you, Christian. Another question. Do you think there will be new bidding areas in the Nordics in the near future or later, and where, if any? Who should I distribute that question to? Is it a question for Matthias?
That's a difficult question for me to answer based on the market modeling and these scenarios. It depends on what you want from the price areas and what problems you're trying to solve, I guess, would be from a market modeling perspective. But I realize it's a very political sensitive area, and it's making your price areas will hurt some and be a gain for others. So yeah, I don't think I can say anything in what price areas should or shouldn't be there.
Thank you. That might have been out of the scope of the assignment you got in the project team. Let's see. Here is another one. Have you evaluated the distribution of new installed capacity, megawatts, and energy megawatt hours linked to each bidding zone in the Nordics, and as such on existing or possible new bidding zone configuration? Maybe it's another flavor of the same question you just responded to, Matthias. And the second part of the question is, it's a bit hard to understand why price differentials would increase by 2040, given that your supply-demand energy balances per BZ for most businesses in the north go from plus to minus and opposite in southern businesses except from Denmark? Oh, this is a very long question. I think it might be difficult in this setting to answer to it IRL. Maybe this is one of the questions we save for our written question and answers.
I can put in a short attempt. One reason that the price differences are increasing is that we are looking at the absolute price difference, not the annual average price difference. So it doesn't matter which way the power flows, it will always provide a positive price difference. And with the increasing volatility, we see that the price differences by using this metric will increase. So that might be part of an explanation.
Very good.
But if any of the other team members have something to add, please do.
Do you have something to add to that from the team, the rest of the team? We might get into more detail to the. Yeah.
No, I was agreeing with you, and Anders, that I agree with Anders, but maybe that question needs a bit more explanation in a written form than we can do right here.
Yeah, we save all the questions, and if they need more elaborate answers, we get back to them in the Q&A document that we will publish after the webinar. So don't be afraid that we will lose the questions. Yeah, here we have another question. As a follow-up, I wouldn't consider SC3 problems to be short-term. In my opinion, you should at least use some form of average availability in your analysis instead of installed capacity. Jan, I guess that's...
Yes, I think it's also a little bit about the identification system needs methods, but we see that we make large investments in the future, so we expect to have a more reliable grids with more room to spare to make this they call it avbrott to upgrade the grid and to do the necessary service that we have to do. Because the parts of this grid between SE2 and SE3 is 100 years old, and we are replacing it now with a more modern grid with much more room to spare to make this avbrott. If someone can just help me with the
disruptions,
outages.
Yeah, outages. Yeah, these planned outages will have much less impact in the future when we have this modern grid that we're constructing, starting from the next few years. Yeah.
Thank you, Jan. Here's another question. Many new developers of both production and consumption often face lengthy processes to get grid connection. If problems are big enough, developers might want to look at other areas in the world where grid is available. Are the TSOs looking at how to speed up access to grid capacity? Might be a question for you, Daniel.
Yeah, I can say something about that. I can first also, I completely agree with this changing system. We need to speed up, and we have, or we are releasing quite soon, a Nordic strategy on, for example, wind power and sector integration. And in that strategy, one of the key topics to address is the fact to how to speed up. So it is on the top of the Nordic agenda, and it is at the table for the Nordic CEOs. That said, speeding up is a lot also about national legislation. So each country will have some different challenges related to this topic, but we will try from a Nordic perspective to really learn from each other and benchmark the different countries and how we do it, and also share technology and so on. So what I can say, it is on top of the agenda. So we need to find tools how to speed up, but it's different in each and every country how it will be done.
Thank you, Daniel. Here's another one. Do you consider use of alternatives to building grid, like the use of grid enhancing technologies to manage the bottlenecks? And a question about new technology, maybe. Who could answer to that one? Is it Lasse, maybe?
Yeah, I can try to answer it. Yes, the TSOs are always looking at must always consider the demand side and response, for example, and other alternatives to grid development, and things like that. So because yeah, and this we won't not end up in a situation where we invest in grid that is not that necessary for a moment. So we also have to consider all alternatives related to grid development and capacity increasing measures. This is also related to investments in peak capacity and things that I always talk that I talk about in my presentation also. And this is also described in the report, I think, and yeah, and in other reports as well.
Thank you so much, Lasse. Now to the last and final question. There are a lot more questions, and we will gather them all in the document after the webinar. But this is the last one. Thank you for the well-prepared and executed webinar. Do you see any limitations on the technology side that could slow down the climate-neutral Nordic scenario? And if so, what would be these technology limitations? A question for you, Matthias, again.
Yeah, that's certainly, as I also mentioned, some uncertainties when going into the scenario and trying to look this far into the future in a green scenario. So such limitations could be that power to X doesn't develop as fast as we expect and want to. It could be that demand side responses doesn't get there quick enough. It could be that the storage solutions, the technologies that's supposed to supply us with the flexibility we need doesn't evolve quick enough. And then there's a whole consumption side. So electrification of industry could also be a barrier that I see. But on the generation side, we have much of the tools already. We have wind, we have PV, we have hydro. So in the Nordic, we are very well suited to this in terms of generation, at least. But we need some technologies to fill in the gaps from the thermal when we phase that out.
Thank you so much, Matthias. That was the last question for this session, and I would like to thank all the attendees for their commitment and their big interest that has been shown in all these questions handed in. So thank you so much for that. And now the time has come to the point where we need to wrap up this webinar, and we will do so by leaving the floor to Daniel Gustafsson again to show us what happens now. Please tell us, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sara, and thank you for moderating this event in a very, very good way. And thank you for the team and all the good questions as well. And as we have mentioned, we will try to really bring these questions in and try to answer them as good as possible afterwards. So don't consider them lost in cyberspace. We can change the slide. Thank you. And what happens now then? Yeah, basically we are in the stage where this report, the Nordic Grid Development Perspective, is being released. And we now have a common Nordic scenario, an updated common Nordic scenario that will be a part and secure the Nordic perspective in the grid planning. So the regional grid plans and the studies will be updated and developed to have this scenario as a basis in the grid planning forward, as well as all other national aspects. As mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, the grid development perspective will be updated every second year. And as you know, the energy system and the outside world is changing very, very fast. So I'm pretty sure that the scenarios will be updated as well, reflecting our best guess of the future. That is how it should be considered. I will also mention, I said that earlier, that the Nordic TSOs, we are also preparing a common Nordic strategy with the focus on wind power production and the development in that area, as well as the sector integration. And that will be released together with our solutions report in the early 2022. So in addition to this planning aspect, the strategy will provide a little bit broader view than we have talked to today, including the market aspect, system operations. And in this strategy, we're aiming for all the most important actions that we have to take up till 2030 to really achieve a clean and affordable electrically enable. We want to enable a clean and affordable system. So that's the vision, so to say. So it will be a little bit more tangible with aspects like reducing lead times and so on. I also want to recap related to the European context that NSOE is publishing the European 10-year Network Development Plan every second year. We have worked with a regional Baltic Sea investment plan that will be part of the NGDP. And the national aspects in the grid planning is also updated continuously. And as Janne said, the next 10 years, we as the Nordic TSOs are building over 10,000 kilometers of lines, over 100 new substations, and are making investments of about 25 billion euros. So it's huge investment that is happening right now. And the aim is, of course, to have a working system, but also enable the climate goals towards some kind of fossil-free future. So it's a very interesting future we have ahead of us. So with that, I want to really thank everyone that have listened. I want to thank the team, Sara, for moderating this, and I look forward to the work ahead. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you everybody for attending this webinar, and stay tuned for the Q&A documentation and for the continuation of this quest for a climate neutral Nordic future. Bye everyone.